You feel everything. Every emotion in the room floods through you like a broken dam. Every conflict becomes your crisis. Every person's pain becomes your emergency. You walk into a space and immediately know who's angry, who's sad, who's pretending to be fine while dying inside. And you've been told this is a gift, that you're special, evolved, a light worker, a healer, one of the chosen few who can feel what others cannot, the sensitive soul in a harsh world, the emotional barometer for everyone else's weather. But here's what they never told you. You're drowning. Every day, you absorb the emotional debris of everyone around you until you can't tell where they end and you begin. You give and give and give until there's nothing left. You heal everyone except yourself. You feel everyone's pain except your own. And in those quiet moments, when you're alone with what's left of yourself, you feel it. The terrible emptiness where your own identity used to live. Carl Jung saw through this spiritual facade with surgical precision. What modern culture celebrates as empathy, he would have diagnosed as something far more dangerous: pathological responsiveness, the complete dissolution of psychological boundaries, a trauma response masquerading as a superpower. Jung understood that healthy empathy requires two essential elements: the ability to feel with others and the ability to return to yourself. True empathy is a temporary bridge you build and then dismantle. It's a conscious choice, not an involuntary hemorrhaging of your psychic energy. What you call being an empath, Jung would call being psychologically invaded. Your nervous system never learned to distinguish between self and other. Your boundaries dissolved so completely that you mistake everyone else's emotions for your own authentic experience. You've become a walking emotional sponge, soaking up the psychic contents of everyone around you. And the tragedy? You've been conditioned to see this psychological wound as spiritual evolution. This video will expose the dangerous reality hiding behind the empath identity, how your sensitivity became your prison, how your gift became your curse, how your empathy became the very thing destroying your capacity for authentic selfhood. But more than that, I'll show you how to reclaim your psychological sovereignty without losing your genuine capacity for compassion. The empath trap has held you hostage long enough. Time to break free. Let me tell you what really happened to you. Somewhere in your childhood, your natural psychological boundaries were shattered. Maybe by a parent who used you as their emotional regulator. Maybe by chaos that required you to become hypervigilant to everyone's emotional state for survival. Maybe by trauma that taught you that other people's feelings were more important than your own. Your developing psyche learned a terrible lesson. Your safety depends on your ability to feel what others feel and give them what they need. So, you became an emotional chameleon. Jung called this the dissolution of the ego structure, where healthy individuals maintain what he termed psychological membranes, flexible but intact boundaries that allow for empathy without merger. You developed no such protection. You became permeable. Every emotion in your environment floods through you unchecked. Every person's psychological contents mix with your own until you can't distinguish between what you feel and what you've absorbed. Every interaction becomes an emotional transfusion where you give your life force to others and take on their psychic toxins. This is not empathy. This is psychological invasion. Real empathy is a conscious bridge built between two intact selves. What you experience is the opposite, unconscious merger between a dissolved self and everyone else's emotional debris. You feel their anxiety and think it's yours. You absorb their depression and wonder why you're suddenly sad. You take on their anger and believe you're the one who's upset. You've become an emotional hostage to everyone around you. And here's the cruelest part. They sense your permeability and use it. Emotional vampires are drawn to dissolved boundaries like predators to wounded prey. They offload their psychological waste onto you and walk away lighter while you carry the burden of emotions that were never yours to begin with. But you've been so conditioned to see this as your purpose that you accept the poisoning as service. Jung warned that without strong ego boundaries, the individual becomes what he called contaminated by the unconscious. Not just their own unconscious, but the collective unconscious of everyone they encounter. You've become a repository for the unprocessed emotions of the world around you, and you're suffocating under the weight. Here's where it gets even darker. You've become addicted to the very thing that's destroying you. Every time you help someone by absorbing their emotions, you get a hit of significance, purpose, the fleeting feeling that your pain serves a greater good, that your sensitivity makes you special, that your suffering has meaning. Jung understood this psychological dynamic intimately. He called it compensation when the psyche creates meaning around its own dysfunction to avoid facing the truth about its condition. Your empathy addiction follows a predictable cycle. You feel empty and disconnected from yourself. You encounter someone in emotional distress. You absorb their pain and offer support. They feel better. You feel temporarily significant. The significance fades. You feel empty again. You seek out the next person to help. But here's what you refuse to see. You're not helping anyone. You're enabling their emotional immaturity while destroying your own psychological foundation. Real help requires teaching people to process their own emotions, not absorbing those emotions for them. Real compassion means holding space for someone's growth, not rescuing them from the very experiences that could transform them. You've become an emotional enabler disguised as a healer. And every time you absorb someone else's pain instead of helping them learn to process it themselves, you reinforce their dependency while deepening your own dissolution. The people in your life have learned they don't need to develop emotional resilience. They have you. They don't need to learn self-soothing. They have you. They don't need to take responsibility for their psychological state. They have you. You've become their external emotional regulation system, and they've become your source of identity and purpose. This is addiction in its purest form. You need them to need you. They need you to rescue them from their own feelings. Neither of you grows. Both of you remain trapped in a codependent prison that masquerades as spiritual connection. If this resonates with you, if you recognize yourself in these patterns, you're ready for the next level of this conversation. This community is for those brave enough to question their most cherished beliefs about themselves. The empath identity has become your psychological fortress. It explains everything. Why you're always exhausted, why relationships drain you, why you can't be around certain people, why you feel overwhelmed in crowds, why you need so much alone time to recover. But Jung would see through this identity construction immediately. What you call being an empath is actually a complex psychological defense mechanism. A way to make sense of your dissolved boundaries and unprocessed trauma without having to face the terrifying work of rebuilding your authentic self. The empath identity serves three crucial psychological functions. First, it transforms your dysfunction into specialness. Instead of someone with damaged boundaries who needs healing, you become someone with rare gifts who needs protection. The narrative shifts from "I am wounded" to "I am chosen." Second, it provides an excuse for avoiding the hard work of individuation, Jung's term for the lifelong process of becoming a whole, integrated individual. Instead of learning to separate your emotions from others, you claim that merger is your superpower. Instead of developing healthy boundaries, you declare that boundaries are for less sensitive people. Third, it creates a sense of superiority that masks deep feelings of inadequacy. You're not like other people. You feel more deeply. You care more profoundly. You're more spiritually evolved. This grandiosity protects you from facing the truth. You're not more evolved. You're less individuated. The empath identity has become a spiritual bypass that prevents you from doing the real psychological work you desperately need. Jung was ruthless about such self-deception. In his work on the persona, he showed how we construct false identities to avoid confronting our shadow material. The empath persona is one of the most seductive because it appears so noble, so caring, so evolved. But beneath the spiritual veneer lies a terrified child who never learned that they could exist as a separate being and still be loved. The empath identity keeps you stuck in this child state, always seeking to be needed, always proving your worth through service, always sacrificing yourself to maintain connection with others who can't love you for who you are, only for what you provide. Here's what Jung would find most disturbing about the empath phenomenon. It represents a collective refusal to engage with the shadow. Your shadow, for Jung, contains everything you reject about yourself: your selfishness, your boundaries, your capacity to say no, your willingness to let others struggle with their own emotions, your ability to prioritize your own needs. The empath identity allows you to reject all of these healthy capacities as unspiritual or selfish, while presenting your dysfunction as evolution. But every quality you reject in yourself gets projected onto others. The people you judge as less sensitive or emotionally immature often possess the very boundaries and self-advocacy skills you desperately need to develop. You've made selfishness your enemy, when healthy selfishness is the foundation of all authentic relationship. You've demonized boundaries, when boundaries are what make genuine intimacy possible. You've rejected self-care, when self-care is what allows you to show up authentically for others. Jung understood that the shadow must be integrated, not rejected. The parts of yourself you've labeled as unspiritual are often the keys to your psychological freedom. Your capacity for healthy selfishness, your right to maintain boundaries, your ability to let others feel their own feelings without rushing to fix them, your willingness to say no without guilt, your capacity to prioritize your own emotional well-being. These aren't spiritual failures. They're the foundation of psychological health. But the empath identity has convinced you that developing these capacities would make you cold, uncaring, less evolved. This is the shadow projection that keeps you trapped. The truth is brutal. You're not more caring than people with healthy boundaries. You're more codependent. You're not more sensitive than people who can say no. You're more boundary impaired. You're not more evolved than people who prioritize their own needs. You're more psychologically fragmented. The empath identity prevents you from integrating these shadow elements by making them seem incompatible with your spiritual self-image. But Jung knew better. True integration requires embracing all aspects of the psyche, not just the ones that feel comfortable or noble. Let's go deeper into the wound that created this pattern. The empath identity often develops from what Jung would recognize as early relational trauma. Not necessarily dramatic abuse, but what we now call emotional parentification or covert incest, situations where a child becomes responsible for managing an adult's emotional state. Maybe you were the family therapist, the child who had to read mom's moods and adjust accordingly, the one who learned to prioritize everyone else's feelings over your own developmental needs, the emotional caretaker who earned love through service and lost yourself in the process. This creates what Jung called a complex, an autonomous constellation of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors that operates below conscious awareness. Your empath complex was forged in the fires of early relational wounding. The complex tells you your worth depends on your usefulness to others. Love is conditional on your ability to manage other people's emotions. Your own needs are selfish and dangerous. Safety requires hypervigilance to everyone else's psychological state. This complex runs your life from the shadows, attracting relationships that reinforce the original wound. You consistently find yourself with people who need emotional caretaking. You're drawn to the wounded, the dramatic, the emotionally dysregulated. And every time you rescue someone from their own feelings, you reinforce the complex that tells you this is how love works. But Jung understood that complexes can be dissolved through conscious recognition and integration. The empath complex only has power as long as it remains unconscious. Once you see it clearly, as a wound rather than a gift, as a trauma response rather than spiritual evolution, you can begin the work of healing it. This doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means learning to care in ways that don't destroy you. It means developing the healthy selfishness that allows for authentic generosity. It means building boundaries that create space for real intimacy rather than merger. But first, you must be willing to grieve the identity that has defined you for so long. Jung believed that every human being must eventually face what he called the individuation crisis, the terrifying but necessary process of separating from the collective and becoming a unique individual. For you, this crisis takes a specific form, learning to exist as a separate being without losing your capacity for connection. This is the core terror that keeps you trapped in the empath identity. You believe that developing boundaries means becoming cold, that saying no means becoming selfish, that prioritizing your own needs means becoming narcissistic. These beliefs keep you fused with others' emotions as a way of avoiding the anxiety of existing as a distinct individual. But Jung understood that true individuation doesn't eliminate connection. It makes authentic connection possible. You cannot truly love someone you're merged with. You cannot genuinely help someone whose emotions you're absorbing. You cannot offer real support to someone whose psychological contents you've taken on as your own. The individuation process requires you to develop what Jung called differentiation, the ability to distinguish between self and other, between your feelings and someone else's feelings, between your responsibility and their responsibility. This doesn't make you less empathetic. It makes your empathy conscious rather than compulsive. It transforms you from an emotional sponge into a conscious bridge between self and other. But the process is terrifying for those who've never learned to exist as separate beings. The anxiety of aloneness feels like death. The fear of abandonment overwhelms any desire for authenticity. The terror of being truly seen as an individual paralyzes any movement toward genuine selfhood. This is where most empaths get stuck. They feel the call toward individuation, but retreat back into the safety of merger whenever the anxiety becomes too intense. Jung knew this retreat was temporary for those serious about psychological growth. The individuation impulse will keep arising, becoming stronger each time, until you finally have the courage to face the terror of becoming yourself. The alternative is remaining psychologically adolescent for the rest of your life, forever seeking external validation, forever absorbing others' emotions, forever rescuing people from experiences that could help them grow, forever sacrificing your authentic self on the altar of false connection. So how do you escape the empath trap without losing your capacity for genuine compassion? Jung's answer: conscious differentiation. This is not about building walls or becoming selfish. This is about developing healthy psychological membranes that allow for connection without contamination. The process begins with radical honesty about your current state. You must admit that what you've called empathy has often been compulsive caretaking, that what you've labeled as sensitivity has often been boundary dissolution, that what you've celebrated as spiritual gifts have often been trauma responses. This admission creates space for real healing to begin. Next comes the painstaking work of learning to distinguish between what's yours and what's theirs. Every emotion you feel must be questioned. Is this my authentic feeling or something I've absorbed from someone else? Is this my responsibility or theirs? Is this my growth edge or their avoidance pattern? This requires developing what Jung called the observing ego, a part of yourself that can witness your emotional reactions without being controlled by them. This witness learns to recognize the difference between authentic empathy and compulsive absorption. Then comes the practice of conscious boundaries, not walls that shut people out, but membranes that allow for connection while maintaining distinction. You learn to care about someone's pain without taking it on. You learn to offer support without becoming responsible for their healing. You learn to love without losing yourself. This is terrifying work for those who've never existed as separate beings. Every boundary feels like abandonment. Every moment of not caretaking feels like cruelty. Every act of self-prioritization feels like betrayal. But Jung understood that this discomfort is the price of psychological maturity. The anxiety you feel when maintaining boundaries is not evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're finally doing something different. The goal is not to eliminate your sensitivity, but to make it conscious. Not to stop caring, but to care in ways that serve growth rather than dependency. Not to become cold, but to become warm in ways that don't require self-sacrifice. What does healthy empathy look like once you've escaped the trap? Jung would call it conscious relatedness, the ability to connect deeply with others while maintaining your own psychological integrity. The integrated empath can feel with others without becoming overwhelmed by those feelings. They can offer support without becoming responsible for outcomes. They can witness pain without absorbing it. They can love without losing themselves. This doesn't make you less caring. It makes your caring more effective. Instead of drowning in others' emotions, you learn to be a lighthouse, a stable presence that others can orient toward in their own storms. You develop what Jung called holding the tension, the ability to stay present with difficult emotions without immediately moving to fix, change, or absorb them. This is true empathy, feeling with someone while allowing them to have their own experience. Your relationships transform. Instead of attracting people who need emotional caretaking, you begin attracting those who are capable of mutual rather than parasitic connection. Instead of giving from emptiness, you learn to offer from fullness. Instead of serving from compulsion, you choose service from freedom. The people in your life must learn to develop their own emotional regulation skills. They can no longer use you as their external emotional processing system. Some relationships will end during this transition. Others will deepen in ways you never thought possible. You discover that you don't need to be needed to be valuable. You don't need to sacrifice yourself to be loved. You don't need to absorb others' pain to prove your worth. These discoveries can be devastating to the identity you've built around being an empath, but they're the foundation of psychological freedom. Jung understood that true spiritual evolution requires the death of false spiritual identities. The empath identity must die for the integrated individual to be born. This death is not the end of your capacity for compassion. It's the beginning of compassion that doesn't destroy the one offering it. The brutal truth they never told you is that your empathy has been a prison disguised as a gift. Your sensitivity has been a wound dressed up as spiritual evolution. Your capacity to feel everything has kept you from feeling yourself. But now you know. The empath identity was never your destination. It was a way station on the path to becoming a whole human being capable of conscious love rather than compulsive caretaking. Jung's message is clear. You cannot love authentically from a dissolved self. You cannot help genuinely from a place of merger. You cannot offer real support while drowning in others' emotions. The path forward requires courage you may not feel ready for. The courage to disappoint people who've grown dependent on your emotional caretaking. The courage to maintain boundaries even when others call you selfish. The courage to exist as a separate being even when separation feels like death. But on the other side of this courage lies something precious, the ability to choose your empathy rather than be controlled by it, the capacity to love from fullness rather than emptiness, the freedom to be yourself in relationship rather than what others need you to be. Your sensitivity doesn't have to be your sentence. Your empathy doesn't have to be your prison. Your capacity to feel deeply doesn't have to mean dissolving completely. You can feel with others without losing yourself. You can care without drowning. You can love without dying, but only if you're willing to kill the identity that's been killing you. The empath must die for the individual to live. Are you ready for that death? Are you ready to discover who you are when you're not busy being what everyone else needs? Write in the comments, I am ready to individuate. Let me know you're prepared to move beyond the comfortable prison of the empath identity and into the unknown territory of authentic selfhood.